Welcome to the first episode of a new series called China Cuts, where we explore questions about Chinese culture, society, history, and language. I'm your host, Chris, and today we'll be talking about Confucius. Many of you have probably heard of the ancient Chinese philosopher Confucius, but some of you may not exactly be sure who Confucius was or what he did. So who was Confucius? To start with, Confucius was not his actual name, but a westernized version of a Chinese term. When Jesuit priests from Europe first started arriving in China around the 16th century, they learned of the Chinese philosopher referred to as Confucius. Many of these Jesuits wrote back to people in Europe about this philosopher, Latinizing Confucius as Confucius. But Confucius wasn't exactly his name. It means Great Master Kong. It is more like a title, like Christ or Buddha. Today, most Chinese refer to him simply as Master Kong or Kongzi. According to tradition, his actual name was Kong Qiu, and he was known to most in his adult life by the courtesy name Zhongni. Tradition holds that he was born in 551 BCE on September 28th, which has historically been celebrated as Confucius Day. But many historians doubt the accuracy of these dates. Not much is known for certain about his life, and much that we do know is wrapped up in myths and legends. He was a rough contemporary of historical figures like the Greek mathematician Pythagoras, the Persian emperor Darius I, and the Buddha Siddhartha Gautama. Confucius lived in the Zhou Empire during the Spring and Autumn period. This was a violent and tumultuous time in Chinese history. The Zhou had ruled most of northern China through a system of feudal lords since 1046 BCE. But their power had diminished after its capital, Haojing, was sacked in 771 in a bloody civil war. The royal court was forced to move its capital to the east in Chengzhou, which is generally taken as the beginning of the Spring and Autumn period. Although the Zhou continued to nominally rule the realm, vassals increasingly ignored the Zhou and ruled their fiefs like independent kingdoms, only symbolically acknowledging the Zhou kings. With weak kings, these feudal lords began expanding their own power by fighting neighboring lords for land, wealth, and people. These conflicts intensified over time as bigger vassals gobbled up smaller ones. On the eastern frontier of the Zhou kingdom was one such vassal state, the state of Lu, where Confucius was born. As a vassal house of the Zhou kings, Lu nobles had prided themselves on their close connections to the Zhou royal household, claiming to be direct descendants of the mythologized Duke of Zhou and preserver of the civilized culture and rituals of Zhou. But just like many other vassal states, the rulers of Lu conquered neighboring lands to expand their power. Lu was also a state on the verge of political divisions amongst three powerful aristocratic clans with their own independent armies that vied for influence and power over the Duke of Lu. It was during this time that Confucius was born into a family from the lower nobility, or Shi class, near the city of Zhou, near present-day Qufu. Zhou had only been subjugated by Lu shortly before Confucius's birth, and it was a region considered culturally distinct from Lu. Zhou was often derided as an uncultured backwater, and it was there that Confucius's father, Kong He, was granted minor land holdings and took as a concubine a local woman, Yan Zhengzai, Confucius's mother. Confucius's father died when he was a young child, leaving him to be raised by his widowed mother. Despite his father's death, Confucius was well cared for and managed to receive an education. At a young age, he developed an interest in the rituals of the Zhou court. One common legend is that as a child, Confucius loved to play games that practiced these rituals. But this is probably more myth than fact. When Confucius was in his late teens, he married a woman named Qi Guan, with whom he would later have a son and two daughters. At some point in his 20s, Confucius made off to seek his fortune in the court of the Duke of Lu. For a while, Confucius served as a local granary official and a livestock inspector. Having been raised by a woman from the backwoods of Zhou, Confucius probably seemed a bit like an outsider, but he gained a reputation as an expert on ritual matters. Ritual observance was a crucial part of Confucius's life and philosophy, and he demanded strict adherence to the form and intent of rituals. Over time, Confucius gained a following of students amongst the aristocracy, seeking his advice on ritual matters and wanting to learn from him. So long as one was willing to learn, Confucius accepted students regardless of their social status. Some of these students would become influential in the politics of the Zhou kingdom. such as Deng, who would later become a diplomat and prime minister for several states, and Zaiwo, who served as prime minister for the dukedom of Qi. With politically connected students, Confucius gained the attention of Duke Deng of Lu, which led to Confucius gaining a position in the duke's court. In 501, Confucius was appointed as a governor of a minor holding, and a year later was made Minister of Justice. Confucius's philosophical and political views were profoundly shaped by his times. He was disturbed by the diminished authority of the king of Zhou, who he saw as the rightful son of heaven. The collapse of royal authority and the never-ending warfare amongst vassal lords were seen by Confucius as a sign of moral failings among the nobility who failed to live up to their social and ritual obligations that held society together. Confucius looked back to the moral leadership of the mythical sage kings of the distant past as a foundation of a stable society and political order he wished to restore, and courtly rituals were an important part of this formula. This philosophy also extended to the aristocratic clans that divided the state of Lu and controlled it in all but name. As the Minister of Justice, Confucius used his position in court to try to curb the power of these families, establishing rules that limited the size of household armies and regulating the size of their defenses. This most likely made Confucius very unpopular amongst these aristocratic families and made him a potential political target. This may have led to his eventual exile from Lu in 497. The true reason is not entirely clear. His policies reining in the power of aristocratic clans may have had something to do with it, but according to many legends, his exile was self-imposed out of protest. The most popular version of the story comes from Sima Qian's Record of the Grand Historian. In this story, the state of Qi felt threatened by Confucius's reforms and sought to undermine his power. The Duke of Qi sent a gift of 80 beautiful dancers and singers and 30 fabulously decorated horse-drawn chariots to Duke Deng of Lu, with the intent of distracting him from his royal duties. In collusion with Qi, the prime minister of Lu, a member of a leading aristocratic family and Confucius's chief rival at court, accepted the gifts on the duke's behalf. The duke was so delighted by the gifts that he ignored affairs of state. Distraught that Duke Deng was so easily manipulated by hedonistic desire, Confucius resigned in protest on the pretext that the duke was neglecting his ritual duties. While this story is popular in most accounts of Confucius's life, it is most likely apocryphal. Later Confucian scholars use this as a way to portray Confucius as a man of moral convictions, willing to sacrifice his career for principles. Regardless of the reasons for Confucius's exile, we know he left around 497 with a large retinue of students. He and his disciples would spend the next 13 years wandering neighboring states in the Zhou realm in search of employment at various noble courts, hoping to find a lord willing to adopt his policies. His years of drifting were difficult for him and his students. Not only was he unable to find employment, but at one point they were destitute and on the verge of starvation. It was during this period that his favorite student, Yan Hui, tragically died of illness, which emotionally scarred Confucius for the rest of his life. Failing to find patronage, advancing in age, and ignored by the rulers of his time, Confucius returned to Lu in 484 after receiving a pardon. And there he spent his remaining days, continuing to teach rituals in a local academy. It was also during this time that tradition holds that Confucius compiled or wrote many of the 5 canonical classics of ancient China: the Book of Rites, Classic of Poetry, the Book of Documents, the Book of Changes, and the Spring and Autumn Annals, for which the period is named. Today, many scholars doubt that Confucius had a hand in these texts, but it's generally believed. In 479, Confucius passed away. The cause is unknown, but seems to have been a natural death from old age. Confucius was largely unappreciated in his lifetime by those in power, but his philosophy lived on through his students, who would later become powerful and influential men following his death. Confucius's disciples continued his teachings. Decades later, they began writing down on bamboo strips their recollections of what the master had said. These were essentially short, pithy quotes and recollections of conversations, kind of like cliff notes, to remind them of the teachings of their revered teacher so that they could teach their own students. Their students in turn took these strips of bamboo and began ordering them and bound them together with string into scrolls or books based on general themes. Today, there are 20 surviving scrolls collated over the 4th and 6th century BCE, which we now call the Analects or 论语. Most of what we know about Confucius's life comes from snippets gleaned from the Analects and a few biographies written in the centuries after his death. This makes it difficult to say anything with certainty about Confucius's life, but the influence of his teachings would extend well beyond his death, making him an important philosopher and an exemplar teacher for the ages. Now you might be asking, what did Confucius believe? What did he teach? We'll try and cover that in a future episode. Thanks everybody for watching, and if you liked what you saw here, click and give us a like or subscribe. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Links are in the doobly-doo below. And China Cuts is produced by the Confucius Institute at the University of Nebraska and is made with the help of these fine people right here. Special thanks for support from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and our partner, Xi'an Jiaotong University. I'm Chris, and see you next time. 再见.